There are those who want me dead. The threats are palpable, so much so that I've had bosses offer to move my family and me from our home. I've had police officers parked outside of our house for protection. And I even had a security officer at one of the newspapers I worked for give me a metal pepper spray stick to ward off would-be attackers. And the question was, what was so threatening about a guy with a pad and a pen? And it's not a modern day concern only. As Napoleon once said, 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. So the question, it rests in the understanding of this, that the threats to an established culture, the same threat posed by Jesus the day he stood in the temple, opened up the book and said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, set prisoners free, deliver the oppressed, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." The threat is against a culture of greed, of power, and of control. Death to the messenger remains a priority in societies where calling out or holding leaders accountable has been deemed unacceptable, unpatriotic, un-American. And those who do such things, some argue, should die. So for the next few moments, here's what I would like you to consider. And it may surprise some of you, but journalists actually see what we do as a calling in and of itself. And that calling mirrors one described by Jesus as he announced his ministry that day in the temple, addressing the needs of the poor, the oppressed, the imprisoned, the enslaved. And the role of the true Christian and the journalist are nearly one and the same. The essence of those callings is caring for the culture in which we live. And just as Jesus' discourse that day concluded with a move to toss him from a cliff, journalists today face calls for execution, simply for holding those in the public eye accountable to the people that they should serve. Now, I spent much of my career over the last 26 years at the Baltimore Sun in what is known as Charm City, the home of the Wire TV series with its tales of drugs and politics and murder. It was there that the threats began against me. And more than any, the one threat that startled my family and me the most came during a press conference when I was being sued for $251 million. The lawsuit was over a story I'd written with a colleague, Walter Roach. We reported how an 80-year-old former congressman had his nephew, who was supposed to be taking care of his finances, taking his pension and retirement money to buy himself a car, run a seedy bar with New York drug dealers, and not paying the former congressman's bills. This was an iconic congressman. His name was Penn Mitchell. He grew up in the same neighborhood as the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. His brother, Clarence Mitchell Jr., was one of the ones responsible for crafting the civil rights legislation that Lyndon Johnson signed into law. And Penn Mitchell himself was the one responsible for the minority set-aside programs that you find in the Small Business Administration. And he was facing eviction from the very care facility where he lived, and all the while enduring the pains of strokes and dementia. So So on TV news, as the lawsuit over trespassing and infliction of emotional distress, which was the charge levied against us, another family member blurted out about how, quote, these punks, unquote, had entered the congressman's nursing home and they would, quote, deal with these punks the way Druid Hill deals with them, unquote. Now, we weren't quite sure what that meant. We knew the group Drew Hill and they would sing and dance, but that wasn't what we figured they were offering. Now, on one hand, I felt like the safest man in the world, right? I mean, someone's on television making a threat. On the other hand, by the time the police might have looked for us, that might have been too late. But by the next time the next major threat came, I had developed a stronger resolve, but I was no less unsettled. I was reporting a series of stories about a multi-million-dollar scam run by a woman who managed to rip off the likes of Ashley Furniture, Tire Kingdom, car dealerships, gas stations. And the victims also included unwitting consumers who were just trying to find a deal. It was a gas card scam, and instead of fulfilling the promise of millions in gas vouchers, Crystal Clark bought herself a car, took trips to Las Vegas, shopped at Victoria's Secret. When the story ran, I got a message left on my voicemail, and after using the N-word, he said, "You better watch your back." Shaken, I renewed a question I had asked myself many times. Why am I in this business? God, why am I in this business? It was at that time when the head of security gave me some options. He opened up a drawer like a scene out of a spy movie and offered some pepper sprays. One was your garden variety, can point and shoot. There were the keychain sprays, and then there was the metal rod with the spray button at the end. And he said, you can spray him and then hit him in the head with this one. I took that one. And actually, last night I found it. So this is actually the one he gave me. So he said you spray it and then hit it. This is not an active learning experience moment. So please do not whack your neighbor. Truthfully, no person is perfect. And if I held virtually anyone under the microscope that I have held those I've written about, not many would come unscathed. But for the grace of God, those stories would be any of us. I felt often like a hired assassin. My stories had led to indictments, forced people out of their jobs, cost politicians their careers. And having grown up in church, I carried a guilt about exposing people instead of simply bringing them to Christ. So I always wrestled with this conflict between involvement in ministry, whether it was helping to plant churches, serving as a youth pastor, starting a nonprofit that we now call the Power of Song Incorporated, and the vocation that seemed in conflict with grace. I practically begged God to get me out of journalism for the good part of 15 years. And the more I pleaded, the further in I went. And the deeper the journey, the more I realized that what I was doing as a newspaper reporter is ministry. It is culture care. Someone has to stand against those who would abuse, oppress, and con other people. It was my journalism that God used to open up doors for ministry for both my wife, September, who you all know as one of the chaplainship worship team members. And as I mentioned, the Power of Song Incorporated, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that September and I created in 2015. That organization now produces September's production, Sounds of the Civil Rights Movement, and as a commercial, which we hope you all will attend next Sunday at 7 at the Alex Theater in Glendale. Now, this organization and the production, they're the result of work with Stanford University history professor, Dr. Claiborne Carson, whom Coretta Scott King commissioned personally to edit Martin Luther King's papers some 30 years ago. Now, because I was still a reporter in 2004, I qualified for one of the 3 major journalism fellowships for mid-career journalists at the University of Michigan, at Stanford University, and the Nieman at Harvard University. And an editor of mine, Diane Fancher, she prodded me to apply for all 3. And with my study plan focusing on African-American entrepreneurship, I said in my application to Stanford that I wanted to work with Claiborne Carson. And I landed the fellowship in 2005, and when I got to Stanford, Dr. Carson and I met, and he asked about my family, and I said, well, I'm here with my wife and my kids, and he said, what does your wife do? I said, well, she's a singer and a songwriter. I said, does she act? I said, no, she's done some theater. Said, well, I have this play, and we're doing a first reading. Tell her to come. And we had just gotten there, and September was very reluctant. She said, we just got here. Said, well, this is the person I'm going to be working with for the year. I think you need to go. And it was September's involvement with Dr. Carson's play that led him to take her to China in 2007 to perform a full-stage version of his play, Passages of Martin Luther King, with the National Theater Company of China. Then in 2011, the State Department funded the full-stage play in East Jerusalem and the West Bank for a month. And as he had for China, he picked September to be the co-music director for the play with the Palestinian National Theater. Now, if I had left journalism, it would have changed the course of events that God ultimately designed to benefit our culture and to counter the weight of oppression and conflict, not only nationally, but on a global scale. So now consider Jesus's, I'll say, feminist approach in his counterculture tactics. His statement, if a man looks upon a woman to lust after her, he has committed adultery in his heart already. Might be more plainly stated in 2018, stop looking at women as sex objects. The standard Jesus sets is a high watermark that all too many have failed to reach, and myself included. So now, not only must we work on looking beyond the color of people's skin to judge them by the content of their character, we must extend that mandate to include a change in culture that demands we look at women as more than just body parts. Jesus' statement aims not only to help men recognize their evil thoughts and deeds, but to rectify a prevenient action that is the antecedent to the wrongful treatment of women. And he instead offers prevenient grace. Jesus initiates a Me Too, Time's Up moment, even during an era when we tend to justify men's actions toward women because it was, we say in a filthy rags justification kind of way, a different time. Here's how he handles it. He defends and comforts the woman caught in adultery, not only out of compassion for her, but in judgment of her accusers. They must walk away from stoning the woman because even knowing where to find her having sex told a lot about them. And the first natural question in the case is, why didn't you bring the man who was involved too? Jesus defies the norms of the time to appeal to the needs of the moment, telling stories that would resonate with their hearers in defiance of what had become accepted culture. There was a Pharisee and a scribe who walked past the suffering man, and there was a Samaritan who helps him. Part of what made Jesus such an enigma was he did it all in a way that you would see journalists do today. Breaking news, this just in, the Spirit is upon me. And it's happening before your very eyes. The parallels between the journalist and Jesus' call are so pronounced that even that threat about reporters so eloquently spoken by Napoleon finds its roots in the New Testament metaphor of the tongue being sharper than any two-edged sword. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me is a cliche steeped in alternative facts. The existential truth is words can prompt adrenaline rushes and hairs to stand on end, such power that the hearer will meet them in battle. Jesus wields his tongue in such a way that it penetrates the heart of the patriarchy while digging out the poison coursing through the veins of victims bitten by culture's most corrupt and venomous snakes. Listen, you have heard that you love your enemy, love your friends and hate your enemies, but I'm telling you, love your enemies. Find something good to do for those you can't stand, who can't stand you, who talk about your mama, those who took the job you wanted using your very own idea. And then how did people respond to Jesus? Give us Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. What he's proclaiming is blasphemy, or could we say fake news? And to what we deem fake news, we cry out, kill the messengers, whether they be newspaper reporters or even the Son of God. Now, journalists are human and thus aren't perfect either. It would be unreasonable to expect that the general public would know and understand all the ethics and standards that professional journalists follow. But to be clear, there are ethics and even case law that have defined the boundaries of journalistic behavior. These standards and laws help guard against abuse even by the reporters themselves, particularly when it comes to their reportage and what they publish. The US Supreme Court decision in New York Times versus Sullivan defined the basis for a successful libel lawsuit, and it is the case that is the one thing drilled into every professional journalist's head. And the primary element is this: it is truth. A very Christ-like concept to be fair, balanced, and accurate. Is it true? I remember early in my career reading an interview with a journalist who was also a Christian. He was asked, how could he be both? His response was, how could he not? When the requisite elements of both demand that I be honest. As noted in the New York Times case, if what has been reported is not true, was there a reckless disregard for the truth? Was the person a public figure or private citizen? But in it all was the greatest defense was truth. So we have sources. The better the source, and on the record ones are always best, the more you can rely on the quality and accuracy of the information. Sometimes we do use, though, confidential sources because they also fear for their lives. Confidential sources can be critical to our reporting and have been to mine. One of my favorites was nicknamed Deep Pasta. This is real, y'all. Okay. So he helped me in exchange for meals at the most expensive restaurant in Baltimore's Little Italy. So over plate-sized veal chops, he provided me information and documents that literally helped free prisoners who were being held in jail for as long as 3 years without a trial in violation of their constitutional rights. In one case, a man was held for 2 years in jail without a trial, charged with stealing a VCR from a pawn shop. Sources, even confidential ones, are critical to our work. If the messenger's life is in danger, how much more the whistleblower or the source? It's not that reporters are without culpability and should not be scrutinized. It's perhaps the most infamous case of a journalist violating public confidence and publishing true fake news was the story by Janet Cook, then of the Washington Post, who won the Pulitzer Prize for a story she fabricated about an 8-year-old heroin addict. When it was discovered that the boy did not exist, Cook was stripped of the Pulitzer, lost her career, and became a symbol of the worst in journalism. And unfortunately, I've known others whose journalism careers ended because of manufacturing stories, including formerly the New York Times' Jason Blair, who was only the second African-American editor of the University of Maryland's acclaimed student newspaper, The Diamondback. I was the first. And USA Today's Jack Kelly, once the leader of a youth group I attended for many years at a church near my childhood home in Maryland. But when it was discovered that these stories were fabricated, they all met swift punishment. True fake news is no more tolerated in the professional journalism industry than it is without. So what all this means, that culture care requires a push for justice. Best stated by Amos, let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. God bless you.